Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the third instalment of the BPCA webinars. This is the first morning webinar that we've done, and that was in response to some feedback that we had from previous delegates. So it'd be great to see what you think today, and let us know at the end whether AM or PM is more suitable for you. I feel we've got 70 attendees today, so I think some of you agree with that. Just a bit of housekeeping before we start. We can't hear you, which is good, just in case you've got any dogs barking or anywhere. That's to not distract me too much. If you have any questions, there is a button that you'll be able to see that says Ask Question. Click on that, type the question, I'll see it pop up in front of me. Although I won't be addressing these questions during the presentation. I've got a space in the middle of today's webinar where we will take a pause and have a look at what questions we've got. So I think that will run a bit more smoothly. And please do make sure you ask questions. So I think it helps everybody, not just yourself. If you've got a particular scenario to do with risk assessments, or you've just got a legislation question, then please do make sure you ask it. You can be anonymous or you can put your name on it. It's completely up to you, but I'll certainly read them out and we'll address them as best as we can do. And also, when you do ask a question, make sure you only ask it once. As I said, sometimes a lot of them can pop up and I can get a bit confused. But yes, just ask the question once. I promise I will get to that. And at the end of the presentation, we'll do another instalment of questions if we've got some. We're looking at sort of 50 minutes to an hour we've got today. So talking about risk assessments, there's a lot to cover within risk assessments, but today is just a real good small instalment just to get us thinking about those things again. And also in terms of CPD points, we have BASIS and BPCA registered points, which will automatically be added at the end of the webinar. Okay, and also at the end of the webinar, you will get a feedback form, so it'd be great if you could fill that out and tell us what you thought about today and going forward and other things we can do. So without further ado, just for those that don't know me at the moment, my name's Natalie Bungay. I'm the Technical Officer for the British Pest Control Association. I also do a lot of health and safety support for members. So we had this idea around risk assessments, because as much as risk assessments for some can seem like a straightforward subject, I think the understanding of risk assessments and when and how is a little bit hazy. So yeah, I think today that's going to be the main topic of address today. So without further ado, let's get going. Let me share my screen with you. Okay, so I believe you can all see that. So this presentation today, it's a practical guide. That's going to be the most useful thing for us. And for small and medium-sized businesses, that is important, because once businesses start getting into employees are over a certain number, things can start getting a bit more complicated. So this guide to risk assessments is certainly more focused at the small and medium-sized businesses. You still have my name there. I've got Tech IOSH there. So just to give you a bit of confidence in me, I do have qualifications in health and safety, NEBOSH, and I'm a member of the IOSH Institute. So hopefully today you can all have real confidence in what we're discussing. And again, ask questions. I love questions. It keeps me going as well. Okay, so just a bit about the agenda and what we're going to cover today. So what is a risk assessment? The law and the risks and your employees, myth-busting risk assessments, terminology, steps, and then implementation. So hopefully all of this will give you, at the end of the presentation, a real good insight and, more importantly, build your confidence. That is what I want to achieve today. So risk assessments. As an employer or an employee, you should be concerned if your employees' or colleagues' health is affected at work. That really goes without saying. And there is, within the industry of health and safety, that's called really a moral responsibility for nobody to come to harm. It kind of makes sense, doesn't it? So you should be concerned about your colleagues' health and if it's affected at work. And to manage this, you can have skills that can be applied to preventing ill health as part of running a business. Applying these measures will protect the business, and also risk assessments form the basis of this protection. So you kind of got to see a risk assessment as the foundation of your health and safety. If you've got the right ones in place, they're filled in correctly, and you use them, then you will have a good management-based health and safety. Okay, so the importance of risk assessments. I know we all, whenever we think about risk assessments, we think, oh, we need to legally do them, which is absolutely correct, of course, and we will cover that. But like I mentioned before, people become ill and they get injured, and we have a real moral responsibility to prevent this. So there's a few statistics there. I won't read through all of them, but workers do die each year from work-related accidents. There's a lot of non-fatal injuries, 500,000, as you can see there. And also, actually, there are also a lot of injuries that aren't reported, and that comes down to process. But the key is that this causes suffering and pain and discomfort to those that have accidents at work, be it falling from a stepladder or cutting themselves, coming into contact with needles, such things. It can cause real pain, and not just physical, but psychological. So it's really important that we understand risk assessments and why we do them. We do them to prevent accidents and death, to be plain. It also includes things like musculoskeletal problems, respiratory diseases, dermatitis. These are all things that we'll be, I say, very familiar with. Hopefully we won't, but it certainly comes into the work that pest controllers do. I know certainly with the amount of driving, for example, that in the industry we can do, it can cause musculoskeletal problems. So, it's just these little things that we really do need to think about. We want everybody to be healthy and happy. So again, just a few more statistics, the most common kinds that would occur, like I mentioned before, musculoskeletal, slips, trips and falls. It's a very common part of our risk assessments. And I do believe sometimes that's put on there as a fail-safe. We just feel we have to put that on a risk assessment. We don't actually really think about what that means. But again, we'll come on to that maybe in a bit more detail later. Handling, lifting and carrying. I remember things like managing storage. So, for example, if you've got a storage container and you've got your technician or even yourself, if you're getting deliveries of what used to be 20 kilo bags of rodenticide, they've been reduced now, as we know, but 20 kilos, that's a lot of weight to be lifting in and out of a store, from a vehicle to a store. And I know people that have sustained injuries doing that. So I think not only for other legislative reasons, but reducing those sack size to 10 kilos was a great thing. Less injuries, I'm sure, will come from that. There's a few more stats there, falls from height and acts of violence as well. I've certainly come across some acts of violence working in city centres. So all these things need to be considered. For those of you, I'm not here to talk about RIDDOR today, but it's mentioned there with RIDDOR. It's the reportable instance of disease and dangerous occurrence regulations, is a mouthful. So there is actually a regulation there as well that tells you that if something does happen and it's within a certain category of injury, then you do need to report that to the HSE. All the instructions can be found on the HSE website, but I'm not here to talk about that today, but I thought it was important to mention. As you can see, RIDDOR is mentioned there. Okay, so risk and the law. As we know, risk assessments are law. The main pieces of legislation of which legal duties are placed upon the employers to prevent ill health which can be caused by work. So the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974, there's lots within the legislation. There's a lot to read through, but the most important bit is the duty of care that an employer has to his or her employees, as well as other people. It's not just the employees, it may be the customers that we are dealing with, or it might be visitors to your office, for example. So so far as reasonably practicable, we have that responsibility. Employees also have a responsibility under this Act. It's Section 7 and 8. So not only do the employers have a responsibility to keep their employees safe, the employees have responsibilities too. And the main one is not to endanger themselves or others, but to also follow the instruction of their employer. So that's really important, that, as an employer, you have to look after your employees, but your employees also have to listen to your advice and your guidance. If they don't and something happens, it can be a very different case in safe court, for example. And also with the legislation, important bit is it places duties on employers and employees, including those who are clients or contracts, like I mentioned. If you're subcontracting, if you have visitors to your site and your customers that we're doing the services for. So that's a real brief look at the Health and Safety at Work Act, but the most important bit. The other section within that legislation is you are legally bound to have a written policy. So it's a policy for intent. So you need to say that my company understands the legislation and I know I need to look after my employees, and these are the things I'm going to do to look after them. So really important we have a policy for health and safety within your business. As we're talking about risk assessments today, the other piece of legislation that's really important, and has actually, gives you a lot of guidance on what you have to do, is the Management of Health and Safety at Work regulations. Management regs is another name for it. But the main piece is Regulation 3 specifically talks about risk assessments. So you've got to see the Health and Safety at Work Act is the main bit of legislation that says you need to look after everybody. Simple. You need to look after everybody. The management regs specifically talks about risk assessments and the need for an organisation to implement risk assessments. Another little bit in there is if you have 5 employees or less, you don't necessarily have to record your risk assessing. You still need to do it, but you don't have to record it legally. Whereas if you're over 5 employees, you do need to legally record it. On BPCA opinion, my opinion, I do assessing for some health and safety schemes. And for me, regardless, if you're 5 employees or less, I do not understand why, if you were doing risk assessments anyway, you wouldn't want to record them. If you're doing that work anyway, and you're thinking about how to protect everybody, why would you not want to record that? Yeah, I think it's common sense. So even though I made that statement about 5 employees or less, you don't need to record your risk assessments, I really do advise that you do in some way. We'll talk about templates a little bit later on, because that can be a question sometimes, a bit confusion about how far we need to go with it. But also Regulation 10, so information for employees. So this is another, I mentioned this because I'm going to talk about it a bit more in a moment. We do all these things. We do risk assessments, we do health and safety policies, we do method statements, and we're really pleased with ourselves. But if we don't share this information with employees, it means nothing. So it's really important. And it says in the regulations that you need to give information to employees. And that means risk assessments, share them. Okay. Simple, yes. So other laws, just again, I have not got enough time today to go through all the different pieces of legislation, but it is important to know that there are other regulations that come within the Health and Safety at Work Act that are more specific to certain areas of work or activity. So there's a few here that you'll recognise, but I think COSH is one of the main ones we will certainly recognise. I was just thinking last night, as you do, and with the cost regulations, the most common mistake I see, or most common address I see, is that we always talk about PPE and we always talk about protecting ourselves, which is absolutely right. Of course, yes, we need PPE. But the one thing with the cost regulations, and in terms of risk assessing and cost assessing, we don't seem to look at the products that we're using enough. We do, as individual pest controllers or companies, we're all guilty of having those favourite products. I'm not going to mention any trade names, of course, but we always have that go-to product that we want to use. And regardless of the insect or the pest that we're dealing with, we think, oh, this is my favourite product. Does this cover the pest? Yeah, this covers the pest. I'll use this. And we don't consider lesser toxic substances enough. We're talking about insecticides predominantly now. I am right now, and we look at those products that we prefer, and we don't consider something with a lower LD50 or with a lower risk rating, because some of them can cause dermatitis to our skin. And so I think it's really important that when you go away today, you have a think about what products you have. Do you really think about your products in terms of cost and risk assessing, and use the least toxic that you have available to you? And even better, do you try to not use a chemical? So that's the one thing I think we don't do enough in the industry. We certainly say that we do try to, but that's the one thing I'd like you to go away today and think about, is when you're thinking about risk assessments and cost assessments, looking at your products and really trying to make sure that you use something that is less toxic than the next. So the other bits are regulations there, manual handling. These are all other pieces that are handy for extra reading for you. As I said, I don't have enough time to cover all of them, but really important for you to be aware of them. The HSE website is great for looking at these pieces of legislation and understanding them. So it really does talk about them in plain English. It's a good resource for you to use. Okay, so I mentioned earlier about our moral responsibility to manage health and safety and risk assessments, but we also have, financial, issues that can arise if we don't. For example, other than employees being made ill and killed, like we discussed earlier, you've got lost time. So, if an accident occurs, you're losing valuable time with that technician or that employee being in the field or the office. You're possibly having to employ somebody else to cover that work as well. You've got retraining costs, bad publicity, and obviously bad publicity is really key now, certainly with social media and the access that we have to really the whole world. So, if it's something that occurs and it gets onto the wrong platform, then it can have real bad implications for your business. And also investigation by the health and safety inspectors, of which I hope nobody will have to experience. If you do, you will know that they will do whatever they need to do. They will come onto your property and they can take any documents they want to, they can take photographs, and they will charge you for the investigation as well. There's been some new information. I think charges have gone up as well. So if you are investigated by the HSE, they will charge you. And normally they will publish on public platforms what they have found if they feel that a case is to be taken. Also, employees taking early retirement, reduced quality of life for employees, court fines, these things, it's a mixture of moral and financial implications if an accident was to occur. So, like I said at the beginning, I'm trying to really hit home how important it is for you to consider trying to prevent risks, trying to manage hazards and preventing accidents. And the last couple of bits there, again, financial compensation claims and increased insurance premiums. So there's quite a few things there. So risk management is about identifying and controlling these health risks before they can cause these problems that we mentioned here. So just going to go on to a little bit about risk assessments and how they will form the foundations of your approach to health and safety. So this diagram here, just really to give you a visual on the process, a 4-step process. You assess, so you assess the risk, you decide what you're going to do, you implement those actions you've decided you need to implement to make the hazard less risky. And then this final bit, managing it. If you're going to put the work in to assess it and to make provisions and to implement these provisions to prevent accidents, then why would you not manage it? Why would you not make sure that everybody's aware of it? Everything is recorded and everything is reviewed as well. That's really important. If you've got a risk assessment and the last time you looked at it was 2 years ago, you may as well put it in the bin. It's not going to mean anything. So you've got to make sure that you review them. That's a whole part of that management. As I said, these we need to, if changes are needed as well within those risk assessments, you need to make sure that they're flagged up. And again, part of management. So common view of risk, and I mentioned at the beginning, it's them having this understanding of risk assessments. And I think, asking a few people that I know when we happen to be talking about health and safety and what their view is of risk assessments. And then these are a couple of them. And it's a fear of getting it wrong, especially if you're an owner of a business or a manager within a region. You think if you get it wrong and something happens, what's going to happen to you, and the responsibility side of things. So that fear can really cause anxiety sometimes, certainly, and it can also cause a low level of enthusiasm, which is really important to have. I mean, with any line of work, especially health and safety, when you're considering protecting people, you've got to have enthusiasm for it. So I'll touch on that in a moment. That's to do with using somebody who's competent to do it. So I'll talk about that in a moment. And where the line is, it's more that, when do you do a risk assessment? You don't necessarily have to do a risk assessment for every single task that is carried out within your daily job role. So, just deciding where that line is. When do you need to do a risk assessment? And really, I'd ask, how can we address these issues? And as I've said, I've mentioned this word a few times, it's increasing your understanding. If you understand something, it will be easy. That's what we want to do. Haven't got any questions coming through yet. I'm obviously covering everything amazingly well, so let's carry on. So common health and safety sayings. I mentioned maybe a couple of these a bit earlier on, but again, very important you understand risk assessments and why we need to do them. So this is why we've got this up here. So significant risks. Now this is mentioned within the management regs, and I mentioned also that the management regs are to do with risk assessments more specifically. And they mention that an employer must assess the significant risks and record them. So you'd ask yourself, well, what's a non-significant risk, which may be it's unlikely that something's going to occur. So, if you're thinking about a hazard, you think, do I need to do a risk assessment on that? If you think to yourself, well, it's really unlikely it's going to occur, then maybe you don't need to do a risk assessment. And also, if the consequences are very, very low, that would be another time when you may not need to do a risk assessment. So significant risks, if you feel that there is a significant risk, then you need to do some assessing. Competent person, that's another. I mentioned this low level of enthusiasm just a moment ago, and it's actually within legislation, and there's been many cases in the media of court cases that have seen massive fines for companies where the managing director or the owner of the company has put in charge of risk assessing somebody who is not competent. So if you put somebody in charge of assessing risks who is not competent, you are maybe causing more of an issue than there was before risk assessments. So what is a competent person? Well, that's really up to you to judge. So you don't necessarily have to have a qualification in health and safety, but it certainly helps to have training of some form. And then in terms of our industry, really experience is a real good indicator for being competent. So, if you've got somebody who's trained in health and safety, but know nothing about pest control, then they probably still won't be competent. They could have all the qualifications in the world. Yes, they could ask questions and formulate a risk assessment through talking to pest controllers, but they're maybe not competent. So if you've got someone within your organisation, of which the HSE they do prefer you to have somebody within your business that is competent to do risk assessments and health and safety management, then that is the best way to do it. So that's competent person. Another one is so far as is reasonably practicable. I've abbreviated it just below there because it's obviously a long-winded word. It's done very much in text, health and safety training. But yes, so far as reasonably practical, as it says on the box. For example, you are going to try and reduce risks so far as is reasonably practicable. Sometimes you can't. The main aim of a risk assessment is to firstly go, right, can we completely, totally and utterly get rid of this hazard? Can we just cross it off and go, take that away? It will no longer be a hazard. We don't even need to do a risk assessment. That really is the first part of your risk assessment. Take it away. But sometimes it's not practical to do that. So we need to reduce the risk rather than take it away completely. So, and you do that as far as reasonably practicable to you. That's what that means. And the last one I thought was quite important to talk about is suitable and sufficient, which is basically, if you look it up, is right or appropriate for a particular purpose or situation. Again, it is what it says on the box, but all these terms are used a lot within health and safety legislation. So suitable and sufficient. Why would you want to do an unsuitable and inefficient risk assessment? It makes sense, really, doesn't it? So make sure it's suitable and sufficient. And again, it would be a competent person that would decide whether it's suitable and sufficient. Okay, I'm going to take a quick pause. I say a quick pause. I can't see any questions coming through at the moment. Just give it a couple of minutes to see if anybody's got anything. But just to go back on, or to summarise on a few bits we've done there, I'm going to be talking in a moment after this section, if we get any questions or not. But I'm going to be talking about the steps of a risk assessment. So we've done a bit about, why we need to do it, the important sayings that we have there, competent person, so far as really practicable, really the whys. So in the moment, we're going to do the hows. Once we've got through some questions here. Again, I can't see any coming up yet. I must just be covering everything, quite efficiently and effectively. So, oh no, here we go. Got a question. So should you ask employees to sign risk assessments? Really good question. So I always look at it worst case scenario. If something bad was to happen, if, say, for example, you had an employee who fell from a step ladder and the HSE were investigating you, you would then most likely end up in a courtroom, be it theoretically or literally, but you would end up possibly with a case against you. So what you need to do then is to prove that you've done everything you possibly could to prevent that accident from occurring. You will always be 100% responsible for your employees' health. You will always be responsible. Nothing will ever take that away. However, we've got this other line of, okay, what have you done to keep that employee safe? Now, the more things that you've done, the more things you can prove that you've done to try and stop that accident from occurring, the less liable you may be, for example, a financial fine or compensation. So you've got to do everything. Now, with that question, should you ask employees to sign a risk assessment? part of the investigation from an HSE officer would be, were there risk assessments done? And were the employees aware of the risk assessment? How are you going to prove that? How I used to address it would, if I ever created a new risk assessment, and again, I'm going to talk about this a bit in a moment, but just to touch on it now, I would do the risk assessment, not just me, but with my staff as much as possible, depending on the size of your team. I would ask for their input in a team meeting and a toolbox talk, possibly. That meeting would be recorded. And then once the risk assessment was completed, again, if you've got a company that's into the double or triple figures, it's going to be hard for every employee to sign the risk assessments. But if you can show that you have shared that information with them, again, I mentioned earlier about the legislation and sharing information with employees. How you do that is up to you, but you need to share it with them, and for your own sake, record that you've shared it with them. So yes, if you can, sign the risk assessments. Team meetings, toolbox talks are great ways to be able to prove that you've shared that information. So hopefully that's answered that. Because if there's any other questions regarding that bit, just pop one up and I'll have a look at it. Another question. So if a site we visit for routine pest control visit, say for example 12 visits per annum, has no changes within that site, so the risks remain the same, how often do we need to do a risk assessment? Do we need to do one and record it each visit, or will one a year suffice? Really great question. So the law states that you have to, as a minimum, review your risk assessments annually, so once a year, or when things change. So again, this is where it comes into sharing information with your employees. Normally on a site risk assessment, we call them site-specific risk assessments. It will be done at the start of the work commencing. And then each time that technician goes to site, they just need to decide themselves, has anything changed? No, that risk assessment is still fine. Now, you might want to note that on the report. We used to do it. There's no one way to do things. There's never one way. So it really is up to you. But as long as the risk assessments are reviewed annually by minimum and recorded, but also the technician is competent enough to be able to decide whether anything has changed on that site. And if it has, then they can implement those changes on the risk assessment. Now, what we used to do is on the treatment report, for example, we'd say no new risks noted. That would simply be it. I would sign it, the customer would sign it, and that would be your nothing's changed statement. So yes, annually for risk assessments as a minimum, but really every time you go onto site, you need to just have a dynamic risk assessment, which is really to do with just doing it in your mind. And if something has changed, then that's when you need to record it. Another question. So is there any body or trade or otherwise within the business that can check the legitimacy of risk and cost assessment in regards to prevention better than cure type situation? So legitimacy of risk and cost assessments in regards to prevention better than cure. So I think, Craig, what you're asking there is there anybody that can, for example, come to your business and check the legitimacy of your risk and cost assessments? And if that is your question, I think, then yeah, we can do that. I do that, certainly for BPCA members. For non-BPCA members, yeah, you've got external advisory health and safety experts. Where there's quite various organisations out there that will offer their health and safety support. But yeah, BPCA for BPCA members can certainly do that. As I said, I've got the qualifications to do so. I do assessing for CHAS accreditation, and they trust me to do so. So yeah, I can do that for you, Craig. Certainly if you're a BPCA member. If not, we can have a chat anyway and see where I can point you in the right direction. Okay, another couple of questions. We're still going. We're doing well for time, so that's okay. Should you go through the correct paths to train an employee to competency? So should you go through the correct paths to train an employee to competently carry out risk assessments So if we had someone who's competent, would any further repercussions occur to the company or managing director if the employee made a mistake which resulted in injury? So there is something called vicarious responsibility, and there is a bit of legislation within the Health and Safety at Work Act that does actually cover this. So if you're a managing director and you say to Bob or Jane, you carry out these risk assessments and they make a mistake, then the HSE officers would look at whether or not that person you appointed was competent. And if they decide, hang on a minute, Bob's never worked in pest control and doesn't have any training whatsoever in health and safety, and these risk assessments were appalling, then there is possibly vicarious responsibility there. So that can happen and has happened. So again, you need to make sure somebody is competent. If say, for example, the HSE see them as being competent and trained, then probably that person who carried out the risk assessing may be up against it more so than the managing director. But again, there's so many variables in that. So hopefully that explains it a little bit. I've got a couple. I'm just going to do a couple more questions here because we're getting on for time, and I'll see if I can cover them at the end. So would an email of the risk assessment to the employee suffice as letting them know? They would, as long as that employee has access. I know, again, I like to give my own examples because I can maybe give some context to it, but I used to work in an organisation, pest control technicians, and some of them really weren't familiar with the system of emails and had an email address for the company but wouldn't use them or didn't like to use them or didn't know how to use them, various reasons. And again, I think in terms of investigation, I always go back to that, because you've got to think, okay, well, if someone from HSE was investigating me, what would they think of it? And I think what they would say is that, yeah, absolutely, if that employee uses their email and we can see that they use their email and that they receive that email, then yeah, great. But if you have an employee that you're aware doesn't use email or has problems using it for any reason, then it could be a problem. Just make sure you know that employee is receiving it and you're confident they're understanding it. That's what you've got to keep in mind. So whichever way you want to share it with them. I'm just going to move on with the presentation now. I've got 3 more questions here. I promise I'll get to them at the end. I'll get through this bit here, and yeah, hopefully we've got some time. We've got a good 20 minutes left. So, okay, so steps of a risk assessment. Let's move forward. If it will move forward, there we go. So, HSE, 5 steps to a risk assessment. We've possibly all come across this. You identify the hazard, you decide who may be harmed and how, you assess that risk and take action, make a record of it, like I mentioned, and you review it. You manage that process, you review it. These are all the most important steps, and you'll see them in any risk assessment form that you might have downloaded or have yourself. You'll see that all these are mentioned. The important distinction as well you need to make is that what a hazard and a risk is. So this comes up in exams quite a lot, actually, within pest control as well. And it's a wordy line, but the official HSE definition of a hazard is something that has the potential to cause harm. So something, so be it a ladder or an activity, something that has the potential to cause harm. And then the risk is basically what's the likeliness of harm occurring, and also what's the consequence. So, what harm is there going to be? Is it going to be a minimal harm, or is it going to be potentially life-threatening? So that's the hazard and risks. The other important element of this is that risk assessment should be done before an activity or work begins. It might seem like common sense, but believe me, there's a lot of instances. For example, sometimes the way that we approach risk assessing is that we'll do a treatment report after a visit, and we'll write on there, yeah, everything was fine. And theoretically that might be okay, but really we should be, doing this before we start work, rather than doing it at the end of the work and going, oh yeah, actually, were there any risks? Oh no, it was fine. So we want to make sure we're doing that beforehand. Just a bit of an example, you'll notice here, this is just a real sort of basic example of a risk assessment. You will be familiar with it. This is just an example for you, nothing particularly. It's just one I picked out on loan work, and it's something I think we all deal with, isn't it? So this is the example in here. But as you can see over on the left-hand side there, you've got hazard. So it mentions that basically the hazard is working in remote locations, lone working. For example, difficulties in dealing with an emergency situation, or if you were to have an accident, that's a real hazard. So we've identified the hazard, who might be affected, so the operative. Sometimes it might be the customers as well, it might be third parties, but in this instance, it's the operative. And this red circle has popped up with highlighting the medium. That's the risk rating. So I've decided that lone working, the severity, that S means severity, so it's a 2. Lone working, that's my judgment. We've got a risk matrix in the corner there, and I've assessed lone working as 2. That's me. Somebody else might put it as a 3 or 4, but a severity of injury. So if something was to happen, how severe is the injury going to be? And I feel that it would be a 2 out of 5. So, and then also the probability. So that's the important thing. What's the severity and what's the probability that this hazard is going to cause ill effect? So again, I put it at 2. That's got us to 4 because you times them together, and the risk rating is medium. So if you look down in the right hand, the risk matrix box, you can see that number 4 is orange. It's amber, sorry, which I don't like amber. I prefer green. So do you know what? I'm going to do exactly what this risk assessment has a purpose of, and that's to reduce that medium to a low. That's my purpose. Those 2 things. I want that risk to go from a medium to a low. So the first bit of my risk assessment is medium. What am I going to do to reduce the outcome of that hazard if something was to happen? And I won't read out the whole risk assessment. As you can see there, there's some basic first aid kit, maybe a process as well. At the end of the day, the worker telephones in just to make sure the manager knows that they're home and safe and well. So these bits here that we're doing has taken me to a risk rating now of low. That is a successful risk assessment. You've gone from medium to low. That is the sole purpose of a risk assessment, reducing risk. Simple, really. So implementation, this I could spend all day on this, and I'll almost have, I think. I'm sorry, with the time is running away with this. But writing and recording a risk assessment is one thing, but actually implementing it is another. You've got to make sure the staff are just as on board as you. So creating a good safety culture, this is a real popular word, again, within the health and safety industry. A safety culture is important. That will be something that you would be audited on. For example, if you had a health and safety accreditation, they would audit you on what's your safety culture like. Just to give examples, of say a factory setting, an inspector may walk around and they'll go and talk to, 1 in 5 employees scattered around the factory floor, just to kind of get an idea of what their attitude is with regards to health and safety. They'll talk to the supervisor just to see what their attitude is on health and safety. And if you've got a speckle of negative view and opinion on health and safety, that's going to run through the whole factory floor, and then before you know it, you've got an accident occurring because nobody respects health and safety. Maybe the supervisor hasn't given that impression that they care too much either, and again, it's just a real catalogue of events that can cause or lead to an accident occurring. Safety culture, really important. If you've got technicians that work with you or under you, you need to make sure that check what their feeling is on health and safety. And if you feel it's not quite up to scratch, then get them more positive about it. Really, really important. Have a realistic assessment and approach. Again, realistic. Be realistic about what you're assessing, what you're recording. You can have too many risk assessments. You really can. The more, if you have a whole pile of risk assessments that a lot of them are unnecessary, that's going to create just kind of, low enthusiasm and a bad safety culture, because they're going to feel that, lots of things are being thrown at them that are unnecessary and it's hard to get through and take in and understand. Be realistic. Have an open workforce willing to flag issues as well. So making sure, not so much whistleblowing, but just, make sure if they see something that's unsafe, they tell you about it. I mean, that is part of their responsibility legally. If a technician sees something unsafe happening, they need to tell you. Make everyone part of it, as I mentioned, a bit to do with safety culture, and decide how you will share risk assessments, like the question we had earlier. Decide how you are going to share them. As long as you share them and you can say to yourself, yeah, everybody here is familiar with our risk assessments and they know what risk assessments we've done and what they need to do to keep themselves safe, then it's thumbs up. So yes, okay, coming to our summary, which is good, because then I've got another 10, 15 minutes, I believe, for some questions, and with the thumbs up, that's great. So yeah, the summary. Understand what it is that you need to do and why. If you don't understand what you need to do and why you need to do it, is it likely you're going to do it or do it well? Possibly not. So understand that. Have a good system for introducing and managing the process. If no one's managing it or keeping an eye on it, before you know it, a year and a half has gone by and an accident's occurred, and actually I haven't done that risk assessment, and you're possibly facing some tricky times. And create a positive and productive culture and attitude. If everybody's on board and everybody's positive about it, then it'll be so much easier for you to implement that. And the other summary is that, remember why you're doing it. Yes, legislation, you have to, but the reason the legislation is there is to protect people and to make sure they don't come to harm, that they have a happy life and a good life, and they don't suffer, be it physically or psychologically. So really important. If you understand that and you appreciate that, then I think you'll find it a bit more pleasant to deal with. Just really quick before we do some more questions, I mentioned CHASA accreditation, for which BPCA members can have as part of their membership. If you need that, again, you can come and speak to me. I can put you in touch with that. Business Shield, we have lots of documents. As I said, I've highlighted the risk assessments there. We've got policies and assessments and templates and safety documents. So anything that you need is there, and I'm always available to discuss them if you needed to. And then obviously ask the technical team. Both Dee and I have our health and safety qualifications, so we can both help you with that. Okay, let's do some more questions. So again, we've got sort of 12 minutes or so hopefully we'll get through a few of them. Should you go through the correct paths to train? And note, we've done that one. Sorry about that, I didn't get rid of it. So Nicholas here. Would an email of the risk assessment to the employees? No, we've done that one again. Sorry, I haven't dismissed these ones. I'm not sure. Here we go. Let's dismiss them, so I'm not reading them again. Everybody just bear with me. Don't start dropping out. I'm pleased to see nobody is, so that's good. Right. Can I just clarify? There is no set frequency in the law for reviewing risk assessments. When there is reason to suspect it is no longer valid or following significant change. So, yeah, there is. So the law will always be, I say vague, I don't like that word, but it will always be vague, and it doesn't say you have to assess it every 6.5 months or 8 months, but it does say annually, and it does say regularly. Now, again, I always come back to if somebody from HSE was investigating you and they were going, okay, yeah, have these risk assessments been reviewed regularly? Anything less than a year, they would say no. And that's their competency telling them that. That's their qualification. That's their authority telling them that. So there is a frequency that you legally need to do. And like I mentioned before, once a year would absolutely, in the eyes of any investigating officer, would be the absolute minimum. But more regularly, if needed, is what the law would say. Hopefully that's answered that one. So I've got Amy here. A lot of this seems to apply to people with employees. If you are self-employed and are doing dynamic risk assessments, you're the only person involved, so you are informed by default, and so you are the only responsible person. What, if anything, do you actually need written down to comply with the law? So yes, so at the beginning we mentioned the Health and Safety at Work Act and the management regs. So if you're under 5 employees, you don't legally need to record risk assessments, including if you're self-employed and you're a sole trader, or the only person within a limited company. And yeah, you don't need to record them, but you do still need to protect your customers, third parties. So, for example, doing a risk assessment or cost assessment for the use of your pesticides. If you were to start a new contract or work on a site where there's lots of machinery, etc., and you're doing some, I don't know, pigeon netting or spiking, then you'll want to do a risk assessment there to protect, not only you, because you still want to do that, but you want to protect your customer and make sure the things that you're doing are not going to cause risks to them. And in terms of, the thing is, depending on everybody has a different approach to where they want to be. If you set up your own business, you're a sole trader, if you want to grow in numbers, then doing risk assessments, regardless of how many employees you've got, will get you in good stead for when you do and start employing more people. So if you're already doing those risk assessments, it's not a new process you've got to start when you take somebody new on. So it's a really good practice to keep up with. But yes, you do. If you say, for example, Amy, we're doing some work and one of your customers come to harm, you would need a risk assessment to prove that you try to prevent that from occurring. So yeah, another question from somebody who doesn't employ any staff. So I presume this changes slightly if you don't employ staff. Also, does every single site need a risk assessment, even small grocery stores, takeaways, etc.? There's no really one answer for that. It really is your assessment. It will always be my advice, always. If I am assessing a BPCA member who's coming on to membership, a new member, we go out and we check their documentation. And yes, legally, you might not need to have a risk assessment for these things. But like I said, why wouldn't you? It's good practice. But if you feel that a separate written risk assessment isn't necessary, then pop it down in your report. That's the other thing. If you're doing a one-off, one-off job for wasps or mice in a domestic property or a commercial property, write the risk assessment on your report. You're just recording that you've considered the risks. Someone mentioned before about the dynamic risk assessment. And that's where you don't necessarily write it down. You just have it in your mind. You mentally consider it. The police force and the military, they use dynamic risk assessing because they're out on the streets and they're coming up against hazards and risks every day in, day out. So they've got to do their assessing in a dynamic way. So that is absolutely essential and fine to do that. Just make sure where you can write it down. And your treatment report is a wonderful place to do that because you can have a section at the bottom. I don't like tick boxes, but that's me. So if you do have a tick box in terms of risk assessment, always have a little bit where you can write information on, okay, there's some hazards here, but you kind of really need to put down what you've done to avoid them. I've got my high vis on, or got safety boots on, I've got my PPE on. So yeah, really your assessment, whether or not you do it for the smaller businesses. Would you have a template for a risk assessment that I could use? I have set up my own and can't seem to find anything. I'm in Ireland. We do. So BPCA members have access to everything: risk assessments, cost assessments, templates, pre-populated advice from us as well. If you're a probationary member, you can also get hold of them. I think what it'd be worth is getting in touch. with the BPCA, give us a ring in the office, and we'll see what we can do for you. And maybe it's something you can come on as a probationary member or something, and we can share those with you, and we can have a chat. So yeah, we can have a look at that, certainly. Is there a template in Excel available for the example you used? The example I used was actually from the Business Shield BPCA member benefit website. So there's a lot on there, but there is a lone working pre-populated risk assessment that, just took a quick shot of it, put it on there. Just an example, a typical example of a risk assessment. So yeah, there's loads of that, David. So get in touch if you want us to sort of guide you to it, but it's on the Business Shield. If you're a BPCA member, it's on the Business Shield website. How can you encourage employees to report near misses? Wow, culture, this is it. It's making them understand what a near miss is and how they can easily report it to you. If you say to them, if a near miss occurs, you have to immediately drive to the office and you have to write a report out, and you have to, give us a video diary of what happened. And I mean, I'm exaggerating a bit, but if you make it undesirable for an employee to report something because they think, I can't, it's not something they want to do, or they can't be bothered, or they just think it's hassle, then they may not do it. So make sure it's easy for them. Make sure they understand what a near miss is. So, something falling off a roof and not quite hitting them, or nearly having a road traffic accident, something like that. Then just say to them, give me a ring and I'll record it. Or here's an accident book and just record it in there for me. And when you're next in the office, bring it in. So make them understand what a near miss is and give them an easy process to report it. If you make it complicated, they may not. We've got I've got 4 more questions left. If we struggle to get through all of them, what we'll do, if I don't get to your question, hopefully we'll have your contact details and we can give you an email. I believe that's okay, isn't it, Scott, to do that? Yeah, we can give you an email and answer your questions, but very conscious everybody wants to probably get off at 9:30. So just do another one here. So I hope this makes sense. We currently use 5x5 matrix for site spec risk assessments. So 3 times 5 equals 15 high. Yeah, I get your risk matrix. Can the technician have a copy of this in the van as a generic one for what we do to eliminate the risk observed as a reference, whilst just using a tick box one or so? Okay, so I think what you're getting at here, so you create a portfolio of risk assessments of which you then pass over to your technician in a folder format that they keep in their van. So they've got all of the copies there. And then when they're on site, they've got the tick boxes and they're just saying, yes, they've risk assessed it because, they understand this risk assessment they've got over in their van. I mean, again, it's your assessment on whether you can sit there and go, yeah, the technicians do know what risk assessments are there. And by them using this tick box on the report form, I feel that is keeping them safe. Then, yeah, absolutely fine. You're sharing the information with them. I'd done a similar thing, had 5 or 6 technicians that, we printed off the important risk assessments, had a team meeting about them. We did get them to sign them because there wasn't too many technicians at that point, so we had enough space on the risk assessment form. But then we also had them in the van with them so they could refer to them. I don't see there's not a problem with that. And again, it's anonymous. I'm not sure who you are, but by all means, if you're a BPCA member, give us a ring and we can have a further chat about it. That would be great. That's what health and safety is a lot of the time. Have we got time for more questions, Scott? We've got time for one more. We've got 2 more after that, of which I said apologies, but we will try to get to you. Sorry, I've just deleted one. I didn't mean to Imogen here. So it's just saying thank you. I won't read that one out. Okay, Imogen, thank you very much for that. From Galaxy again, do the rules for not doing a risk assessment as a sole trader apply to Ireland as well? So if you're talking Northern Ireland, yes. If you're talking Republic, I say it won't be necessarily the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974, but you will have legislation that will apply, I would assume, to Ireland. My studies haven't been around the Irish law or Republic, but I would bet quite a lot on that it would cover that. So we've got one more question, Scott. Can we do it? Yeah. Okay, so last question. this link may be of use for the member in Ireland. Oh, here we go. We've got a link here. So I'm not sure how to share that, but the question from before, we have a link here to managing health and safety risk assessments. Yeah, it's to do with Ireland and the health and safety organisation over there. So we will share that somehow and get that to you. That comes to the end of it. Just remember CBD points, basis prompt points, BPCA registered points, they'll automatically be uploaded. So please ensure you do that. And thank you for your time today.